Welcome to Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is June 10th, 2010, and my guest is Scott Sumner of Bentley University. His blog is The Money Illusion. Scott, welcome back to Econ Talk.
Thanks for inviting me, Russ.
Our topic for today is growth, very broadly defined. Why do some countries do better than others? What role does public policy play in determining or affecting growth? And you've written a lot on this topic recently at your blog, and you've written a very interesting paper on the topic as well. We're interested as economists and citizens in the relation between economic policies and outcomes of various kinds. So I want to start by trying to clarify some language about how we might describe different policy regimes, different rules of the game. And inevitably, these are crude definitions because there's so much variation, but it's helpful to categorize things broadly, and you've been doing that lately. In particular, you make a distinction between different kinds of liberalism. Can you describe those?
Okay. I distinguish between what I call classical liberalism, which is sort of belief in small government in economic sense, and modern liberalism, which is more socialist in orientation, and then neoliberalism, which I see as sort of a postmodern synthesis of the two, where it combines relatively free markets with a sizable government in terms of social welfare spending especially. So if you break down government activities into two broad groups, one would be social welfare spending, which forms a large chunk of total government spending. And the other set of government activities is sort of a catch-all I call statism, which involves things like price controls, market entry controls, trade barriers, ownership of companies, high marginal tax rates, all sorts of things that sort of distort the free market but are not necessarily associated with large levels of government spending.
And so in today's world, let's take a look at some different countries, and we might take some thinkers as well. So let's start with the thinkers. So Adam Smith would be a classical liberal.
Yeah, and there's some debate about this, but I argued that he probably would be in that category, believer in small government. He did, of course, favor some roles for the government, but even in the smallest governments in the world today, places like Hong Kong, the government is still substantially involved in the economy in a number of ways. So it's always a question of relative tendencies rather than either or.
And the classical liberals weren't anarchists. It's not like they believed in a limited state, not a zero state. So they were happy to see government role in the courts, in the enforcement of property rights, police, perhaps fraud, various forms of the legal system's involvement unavoidably in the economic system in their eyes. So that's classical liberals. A modern liberal would be someone like...
by the way, before we continue, I'd also put modern economists like Hayek and Friedman in the classical liberal.
Absolutely. Although Friedman would occasionally go, and Hayek as well, would be open to various forms of redistribution through the state. But in the part that you call statism, the role of the state in regulation and altering prices in what we might call the nanny state, paternalism of various kinds, they weren't particularly eager to see the state involved.
That's right. It's a question of degree. They were probably somewhere between my definition of classical liberal and neoliberal.
And I would put myself in the classical liberal camp. You can put yourself somewhere in a minute when we get through the rest of the definitions. So the classical liberals, limited state, both in terms of the size of government and its role in economic life, but not zero.
Right.
A modern liberal would be someone like whom?
Maybe Galbraith.
Yeah.
Who believed both in a large amount of income redistribution and social insurance, plus a large role for the state in actually regulating, perhaps owning certain enterprises, that sort of thing.
Steering outcomes.
Yeah. So And I associate modern liberalism with sort of a time period running from, it started in the late 19th century, but it really got going in the Great Depression and peaked in the 1970s, and then in the late 70s, the neoliberalism era started with sort of the synthesis of the two. And what it involved is governments all over the world, and this is something I really like to emphasize, regardless of ideology, almost every country in the world substantially reduced the amount of statism, that is, actual government ownership, price controls, regulation, trade barriers. Almost all countries, including the Nordic countries, sharply cut their top marginal tax rates on income. So these were all indications of a movement away from statism after the late 1970s towards this neoliberalism synthesis where most countries kept a fairly large welfare state. I'm talking now about developed countries especially. Most of them kept a large welfare state, and the government as a share of GDP hasn't really changed dramatically since the 1970s. But what's happened is the amount of statism or interference in the markets has been reduced in most countries by quite a bit.
Well, of course, it depends a lot on which country, and I think it's important to mention that inevitably we deal with very crude measures when we try to implement some of these ideas empirically. So, for example, a lot of people use the size of government as a measure of how involved the government is in the economy, and as you point out, a lot of what government does in the modern world in developed countries is redistribution. It's Social Security, it's healthcare. Although when we start to talk about healthcare, it's kind of hard to think of that as it's not pure redistribution. It involves a great deal of intervention. Exactly. So before we go on, I think I want to challenge you a little bit. And let's talk about the United States, and then I want to talk about interesting countries like China and India, which have clearly changed a great deal. But let's stick with the United States. Clearly, the United States in the late 70s had a macroeconomic crisis of sorts that called into question a lot of people's ideas about what they believed in. We had very high rates of inflation. At the same time, we had high unemployment. We had been told that was impossible. So the fact that it was happening did lead to some realignment in what people thought about, certainly Keynesianism. And there was also at the same time this view of what we might call liberalization in the classical sense of the term, a reduction in the role of government. But it's a pretty complicated mixed bag. So I want to let you make the case, because I'm a bit of a skeptic. There was certainly deregulation in the areas of transportation, trucking, railroads, air travel were all had strong changes in the United States. The government's role got much smaller. A lot of regulatory infrastructure was dismantled in those areas. There was a lot more freedom to compete. There was more freedom to set prices. But when I look at a lot of other areas of the economy, all maybe a lot more important, it seems hard to contend that we moved toward a less regulatory regime. For example, in healthcare, government got increasingly larger in how it steered resources and prices. In the financial sector, it got increasingly involved, particularly in bailing out losers, which was a huge, to me, we talked about it before in the program, a huge factor. In education, government's role got dramatically larger. In areas like consumer regulation, I think about cigarette smoking, trans fats at the both federal and local level. So many areas I see government not getting smaller. So what's the evidence that this trend is as powerful as you say it is?
Well, here I'd like to distinguish between two types of regulation. One would be what I would call economic regulation, and the other would be things like health, safety, environmental, which also obviously are economic in a sense, but the motivation is sort of different. And I think that if you look at economic regulations, first of all, I think the deregulation has been broader than you might think. Not just transportation, but you mentioned banking. Banking was very sharply deregulated in the early 80s. Removal of price controls on interest rates and all sorts of branching regulations. When I lived in Chicago, banks were only allowed to have one branch, no matter how large they were. even the largest bank in Chicago.
I remember those
and so
high customer service days.
You mentioned healthcare. New York removed price controls on hospitals at some point in the last few decades. There were rent controls when I moved to Massachusetts. Those have been abolished. Some cities, of course, still have rent control, but I think there's been a lot. The communications industry, the amount of deregulation and increased competition. When I was young, basically AT&T was almost a monopoly of the phone system. It was a very heavily regulated monopoly. So, I think in many of those ways, but what I usually point to is 4 primary examples of deregulation in the or what I would consider neoliberalism in the United States. One is the deregulation we've been talking about. A second is the sharp cut in marginal tax rates from about 90% at the peak to, more like 40% or so now. A third was a movement towards freer trade, NAFTA, other trade negotiations. And a fourth was welfare reform, replacing it with the things like the earned income tax credit, replacing sort of an open-ended opportunity to have welfare with the earned income tax credit. So I think these 4 reforms were all sort of in the neoliberalism direction and were very consistent with what was happening in almost all other developed economies at the time. So it's important to remember when we think about these issues that the things we were doing, like cutting marginal tax rates and deregulating airlines and reforming welfare and freer trade, almost all the countries are doing the same thing, at least almost all the developed countries.
Is it true that let's talk about the last one, the welfare part. Do you think that the social safety net, broadly defined, has gotten more work-oriented in the developed world over the last 25 years?
Well, I'm not an expert on this, but I think the countries that have pursued neoliberalism most aggressively outside the United States, like, the Nordic countries, have shifted towards systems where people are increasingly encouraged to work. So there's a lot of support for you, but you can't just sort of choose not to work as much as you could have 20 or 30 years ago in those countries.
Okay, so that may be.
And by the way, those countries also have an enormous amount of neoliberal reforms that we have not done. So the Northern European countries are far ahead of the United States in privatization, for instance.
Yeah, I want to talk about that in a second. But the two points I'll certainly concede is that since in the last, say, 30 years, going back to 1980, there has been a large reduction in marginal tax rates around the world, and there has been a disenchantment with price controls, with explicit price controls. Although I would argue, again, I think in healthcare, some very important areas, there's still lots of price controls. But certainly, it's comforting as a classical liberal that as the price of gasoline has risen in the United States, there's been little demand for the price controls of the 70s. And I think that's because I think Milton Friedman said it on this program, people had a bad experience with them. They didn't seem to work very well. And Friedman suggested that when enough time passes, that the people who were living in that era die off, they'll become more appealing again. But let's put that to the side. So that I think the two areas that we certainly see going around the world that have been reformed are a disenchantment with direct price controls and a reduction in marginal tax rates. I'm not sure.
Well, there's one more very important one, yes, which is privatization.
Yeah, so talk about privatization. Essentially, let's move outside the United States and talk about some of the other nations.
Well, and I was going to mention that the one problem with having the vantage point of the United States is it sort of makes us miss how big the revolution is, because we already started from a more market-oriented economy than most other countries. So we didn't have a lot of government ownership. We privatized Conrail and a few other companies like that, but in other parts of the world, there was an enormous amount of government ownership, often of just sort of mainstream manufacturers like steel companies, auto companies, and so on. And even the countries that have a reputation of having not done much neoliberal reforms, like places like France and Germany, have done a substantial amount of privatization, even Italy. So that's definitely a worldwide phenomena. Obviously, in the formerly communist countries, there's been a lot of privatization as well. But it's been true in the developing countries, in the European countries, and former Soviet bloc, pretty much everywhere. And that might have been the single most important neoliberal reform. So it's definitely, and it's an ongoing process. It's not something that ended with this financial crisis, although you'll read news stories that talk about how the neoliberalism era is ending. But I would expect over the next decade there will continue to be a lot of privatization all over the world. And the European countries, in many respects, have gone farther than the United States. I'm not an expert in this area, but I've read many articles about how they privatize things like, airports, air traffic control, highways, some rail lines, passenger train, post office. In Sweden, you have a lot of for-profit schools popping up in K2 through 12. You have school choice in Sweden, in Holland. Water systems that are often government-owned in the United States are heavily privatized. So there's just a lot of sort of what are thought of as traditional government services in the United States that are increasingly being done by private firms in places like Europe.
Now, one of the ways that can be done is through contract, and I guess for me at least, there'd be a big difference between government contracting out for some of those services versus government opening up to a more competitive world. Of course, you can contract in competitive ways, you can contract in uncompetitive ways.
That's right. Yeah.
So part of the challenge of trying to measure any of this would be what we're really interested in, speaking as a classical liberal, is how much economic activity is steered from the top down versus the bottom up. When the government gets out of the education business, that's a big difference than, say, a charter school system, which introduces a little more competition than in the current monopoly public school system, but it's not quite a free market in schooling.
Exactly, and I think you have, and that's why, I think you have to go further than just charter schools, and that's why some of the European reforms, like the for-profit schools, are so promising. I should say this, that I agree with you that privatization per se really isn't the issue, because if you privatize and maintain a monopoly, the company may be no better than before. The problem with state ownership isn't so much that the state owns the company, but that they tend to do two other things. They create barriers to entry, and they subsidize the company.
Yeah.
And if you have a government-owned company, the one I usually like to cite is Singapore Air, which is not subsidized and not protected from competition, then it actually runs pretty much as a private company would. It competes as a private company. So the fact that it's government-owned doesn't really matter that much in that case.
It would be the equivalent of maybe a local public school having to charge the full price rather than being subsidized by property tax to make the price to the consumer zero.
Right. And, one of the things that's driving the privatization in Western Europe is the whole European Union project. And I know a lot of Americans, especially sort of free market-leaning Americans, are skeptical of the European Union. But one of the nice things about it is that they've encouraged this idea of a level playing field. And what that has done is forced countries to cut back on the amount of protection and subsidy they provided to their own domestic champions. And this has made the European Union somewhat more of a free market economy. Yeah. There's still a lot of flaws, obviously.
Well, the trade issue
pushed them in that direction.
The trade issue that you talked about earlier, that you mentioned in passing, America in 1980, 85 is a pretty free trade country. We still had thousands of tariffs and quotas, but they were relatively low compared to what they'd been decades before. They had fallen in the post-World War II modernization of GATT and other changes. But the rest of the world was a much less free trade. So they have made much bigger strides, I think, than we have. I think a lot of what we've done has been disappointing, but we started at a pretty free trade level. And you're right in making a distinction that if you're a country in Europe that now has more open borders, even just with the rest of Europe, you can see some economic impact that's going to be fairly dramatic.
Yeah, and they also have opened their borders quite a bit to the rest of the world. I don't know the most recent data, but and it sort of varies country by country. There can be subtle, varies. The northern European countries have a reputation of being a little bit more free trade oriented than the southern European countries, even though theoretically they all have the same common tariff wall. So there are regional variations, but I think it's fair to say that the U.S. is probably not the most free trade economy of the developed countries anymore.
So let's talk about some of the misconceptions people have about policy regimes around the world.
Yeah, a good place to start would probably be the Nordic countries.
Yeah, because we think of them as sort of socialist models. We think of Sweden and Norway and Finland and Denmark as being, well, they're basically socialist, and yet that's not quite true.
In fact, Denmark might be the most perfect example of neoliberalism. I talk about it quite a bit in my paper. It's number one in a lot of interesting and seemingly unrelated categories, and so one that I'll talk about is the distinction between statism and social insurance. By some surveys, Denmark has the most equal distribution of income in the world, and it has a very large government sector. Although, like every other country, it reduced its marginal tax rates at the high end quite a bit. But it has a very high overall tax level and a very large government sector. But in terms of the rest of the economy, it's surprisingly free market. And I know that we've talked about the fact that the various rankings of economic freedom are kind of dubious. But for what it's worth, if you take, for instance, the Heritage Foundation, which has 10 categories, 2 of them involve size of government, taxes and government spending. If you take the other 8 categories that involve a lot of things like free trade, regulation, property rights, and so on, Denmark is actually the most free market economy in the world in those other 8 categories. So I found that kind of interesting.
Do you know offhand what those other, you said regulation?
I'm sorry, I don't have that in front of me.
But
it involves things like courts and property rights, trade, price controls.
Well, that's okay. Another measure of how free an economy would be how easy it is to start a business. Those of us outside of who don't travel a lot, don't start a lot of businesses around the world, we have a vague idea of how hard it is or easy it is to start a business. Hernando de Soto has done a lot of interesting work on the bureaucratic barriers to entrepreneurship around the world. Of course, there's corruption, which is often a measure that's used in these freedom indices. Mm-hmm. If I want to start a business in Norway or Denmark, is it hard or easy compared to, say, the United States? Do you have any idea?
I think it's probably fairly easy. I mean, I think the U.S. scores pretty high in that regard, too.
It does. It's fairly easy.
I mean, the one criticism I've heard of the Heritage Foundation's rankings is that what they call economic freedom is to some extent what should be called good governance.
Yeah.
A blogger named Stats Guy made this point in a recent post. And good governments involve low levels of corruption, transparency, level playing field, those sorts of things, not having to pay a lot of bribes to start a business. And so a lot of that is being picked up in these free market rankings. And so it isn't so much that the governments are small, but that they function very well. And that's what the Nordic countries tend to excel in. And actually throughout the world, that sort of economic policy regime does seem to be correlated with various surveys of corruption levels. So countries that have low levels of corruption tend to have, first of all, relatively free markets according to these rankings, but especially in these areas that involve good governance. Things like transparency, ease of starting business, and they also tend to have, fairly low trade barriers and other interventions of that sort.
Yeah. Now, of course, there's a strong cultural aspect of this that we'll get to. But before I forget, I want to tell a story because I think it illustrates this point extremely well. Former dean of the Washington University Business School, Bob Virgil, told me the story was in Egypt, and he went to the tomb of Anwar Sadat. Sadat had signed a peace treaty with Israel, and he was assassinated. And there's a memorial in his honor, and that memorial has a guard, Egyptian soldier on guard, maybe more than one. And when Bob Virgil was there visiting, the guard asked Bob if he wanted to have his picture taken, and Bob said, that'd be great, because Bob had a camera with him, but he was alone, I think. So the guard took Bob's picture, and then he put his hand out for a donation, contribution, whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
And Bob was kind of taken aback. As an American, going to, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier at Arlington Cemetery and having an American soldier ask for money for doing you a favor is just unimaginable.
Yeah.
In the rest of the world, it's par for the course. That's just the cultural norm that's there for whatever reason. So these cultural norms, for example, about getting a form expedited in the United States, if you're trying to start a business and you want to hurry things along, you usually don't slip a guy a 20, but in other parts of the world, you probably do. And in a way, that's just as long as you know that, it's just a cost of doing. It just seems it's not just a transfer. But of course, there's some uncertainty about it. Sometimes there's negotiation that slows the process down. Sometimes people exploit it in ways that are not so attractive. So I think when we talk about good governance, it's not so much, we only have 4 forms to fill out and they have 8. Sometimes it's just the underlying way that people interact with each other, the level of trust, the expectations that people have that probably have a very big and unseen impact on how easy it is to get stuff done.
Right. And I think that I was sort of influenced by some other studies that looked at this, and one term they use is civic mindedness or civic virtue. And there's a lot of interesting surveys that have been done all over the world asking people questions like, here's one, under what circumstances is one justified in accepting government benefits to which one is not entitled? Mm-hmm. In other words, is it okay to cheat the government?
Because it's only the government.
Yeah.
You're not really unemployed, or you don't really have the requirements for welfare, but you take the check anyway. Right.
Now, if you look at, I did a study that looked at 32 developed countries. And if you look at those 32, Denmark actually comes in second on the list in terms of being most honest or least likely to say it's okay to steal from the government. And they come in number 1 on surveys of corruption that are done by Transparency International.
That they're the least corrupt.
Yeah. So if you average the 2 surveys, Denmark is by far the most honest. And interestingly, on both of those, very different surveys. One is where you ask people, is it okay to cheat the government? And the second is a more sort of an outsider's view of the country, Transparency International. Greece came in dead last. And of course, Greece has been recently embroiled in a controversy over the fact that they were apparently cooking their books on the budget situation.
Yeah.
And then if you look at, neoliberalism, I talked about the 8 categories I looked at for statism. Denmark is the most neoliberal country of the 32. Greece is the least neoliberal.
On the statism dimension, meaning they're sort of...
The 8 categories outside of size of government. So putting aside the size of the welfare state, if you look at all the other interventions of the government, Denmark does the least of those interventions, Greece the most of these 32 countries. So, and if you do statistical tests, there's strong correlations throughout. So there does seem to be a pattern here where countries that people are fairly civic-minded and have a sense of we're all in this together end up with governments that are more neoliberal. And those where perhaps people are less likely to trust those outside the family and don't feel there's anything wrong with taking benefits from the government. Maybe they view the government as sort of the enemy. Whatever the attitudes are, you end up with more statist regimes in those countries. But, and this is a very important point I want to emphasize, I'm not really arguing that these cultural differences are in any sense innate or immovable objects, and I'll give you sort of a counterexample to that. If you look at East Asia, there are big differences in levels of corruption, even among countries with fairly similar ethnic backgrounds. Like on my list, there were two Chinese majority countries, Singapore, which ranks fourth in the world on lack of corruption or honesty, and Taiwan way down at 27 out of 32. So two countries in East Asia, both Chinese predominantly, with vastly different levels of corruption. So government policy, I think, can make a difference, even beyond the cultural values that people bring to the
But of course,
table.
The biggest challenge is what happens down on the ground, right? So I always think of this story I read in Bill Easterly, where he talks about spending more on education didn't produce the results, anti-poverty results that reformers had hoped for.
Mm-hmm.
So they spent a lot of money, they built all these schools, and then it turned out the teachers didn't show up. Now, you could pay them to show up, but if they don't teach when they're there, you still haven't gotten to the outcome you're hoping for. So certainly, if you're in a culture that you feel guilty taking money and not showing up, or taking money and showing up and not doing a good job, it's good. It's better to be in a culture where people feel guilty about that, and you don't have to constantly incentivize them and monitor them, et cetera.
Right.
So there's no doubt that those cultural factors make a difference, and changing what appear to be the rules of the game may not actually change the rules of the game. Do you know what I'm saying?
Exactly. And, another side of that is that the other part of government, the welfare state part, works better in a high-trust society. A couple of, I believe, French economists, Augen and Kuhak, I think, did a study where they looked at this, and again, they focused on Denmark, which has a very generous social insurance for the unemployed. And obviously, if people say that, I would never take a benefit to which I'm not entitled, it's easier to make that kind of social insurance system work on a sort of voluntary basis. In countries closer to the Mediterranean, where the public exhibits less civic-minded attitudes, instead of offering a lot of social insurance to the unemployed or large unemployment benefits, they tend to have barriers to firing people.
Right.
So it's very hard to fire workers. That's the way they protect them. So the Danish system, which is called flex security, combines sort of the flexibility of the free market with the security of fairly high social insurance. And there is a real question as to whether that system would work outside of Denmark, where civic attitudes are different, or would it be abused?
Yeah, no, that is, I think, one of the things I hope comes out of this conversation for those of you out there listening is how hard it is to hold other things constant. Whenever people talk about what works or doesn't work, or correlations between this and that, you always should be asking, is there a third factor, an underlying factor that's causing both of these, so that I can't just switch this lever from on to off or off to on and get the changes that I see in other countries where it's switched in that direction.
Exactly. And, the other thing that I would emphasize is that there's two senses in which culture might make it impossible to institute certain kinds of reforms. One is it might be hard to simply get the reforms passed through your legislature because of your culture. And the second is, if you could impose them, say by a dictator, they may not work because of different cultural values. Do you see that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely.
And
that's kind of what I'm getting at, I think.
For instance, my own views is I prefer a model somewhere between neoliberalism and classical liberalism, and I talk a lot about Singapore. And one of the things that people sort of debate with me on that is they say, well, Singapore is a very different country, from the United States. That wouldn't work here, and so on. And I think that there's really two questions that are tied up there. One is, could we actually get those reforms enacted in our Congress? And I agree there's a lot of doubt that we could do that. The second is, if we could, would they work? And on the second point, I actually think they would work in the United States if we could get them enacted. On the other hand, if we could enact the Danish reforms here, I'm not sure they would work even if they got through Congress, because people might take advantage of the system more than they do in Denmark. Do you see that distinction?
Absolutely, and I think absolutely, and I think one of the things that people used to say in the 80s and 90s about, say, Japan's success, when a lot of people say, "Oh, there's who we ought to be emulating," or the Scandinavian countries, was that they have a very homogenous population,
right,
which some people use as an excuse to explain why they were successful, even though they weren't so free market. Others would say, well, yeah, it works for them. It wouldn't work for us. We don't have that cohesiveness. They're smaller, et cetera, et cetera. I want to ask you something, though, before we go on. And what I want to turn to after this is the sort of broad brush empirical conclusions people are drawing and fighting over in the 1980s and beyond that you wrote about recently. But before I get there, I want to ask you a question about marginal tax rates. Mm-hmm. I think if you'd asked economists in let me not ask it that way. Let me ask it more simply. Can you make a distinction between statism and high marginal tax rates, which you, I think you want to do? So it's obviously the case that you can raise any amount of money that you're going to raise in all kinds of different ways. You can raise it through high marginal tax rates versus lower marginal tax rates. You could raise it through a sales tax, a value-added tax. There are all kinds of different roles the tax system can play in raising, in particular, holding the amount of money that needs to be raised or the one that's going to be raised constant. Is it the case that as government gets larger, even when it's mainly redistributive, as it might be in the Scandinavian countries that we're talking about, that the high tax burden, let's forget the marginal part of it, just the high tax burden, does that play any role in economics?
I think
other than the standard supply side? Because I think it does, and I want to hear your thoughts first.
Yeah, I think it does. And, in my view, that's why a country like Switzerland is wealthier than Denmark and Sweden, is that it has a smaller government, lower taxes, and the United States for that matter. But the U.S. is obviously different in many ways, whereas Switzerland is another small, European country. But I think there's 2 points here with marginal tax rates. One is just sort of the overall size of the tax burden. And if you have a very large government sector, say 50% of GDP, inevitably, no matter how well you set up your taxes, you're going to have inefficiencies, distortions created by those taxes. It's going to discourage people from working and so on. But in addition to that, you can also set up your tax system in a very inefficient way for any given amount of revenue. So, for instance, the countries that raise the most revenue, places in Northern Europe, tend to actually have fairly efficient tax systems given the amount of revenue they have to raise. And by that I mean they don't have 90% tax rates on work. They don't have heavy taxes on capital. In fact, their taxes on capital tend to be lower than the United States. I think in most cases they have lower corporate tax rates. Some of them have no capital gains tax. Some have no inheritance tax. It depends country by country, but on the whole, what those countries do is they tend to tax work and consumption very, very heavily, but don't have very punitive tax rates at the very high end, which run into the Laffer curve problem, and they don't tend to have heavy taxes on capital, which would reduce investment and growth in the long run. So they make the best of a bad situation by raising a lot of revenue with as efficient a tax system as they can.
Let me ask a different version of this issue, or raise a different version. One of the things that I've always thought was the strength of the United States is that because we've had low marginal tax rates, we have a pretty high average burden, not relative to all other countries, but it's pretty high. And as you say, it's fairly constant. It's stayed until recently in the low 20s, right? It's about I'm talking about the federal government. It's about 20%.
Probably low 30s for total.
Yep. So still, but relative to those European states, still relatively low. But because we have low marginal rates, we don't have the progressivity has been narrowed a bit since the 80s. We let people in the United States get fabulously rich. It's true the government takes a big chunk of it if you earn it in particular ways, but you can get fabulously rich in the United States, and we let you lose all your money as well if you invest in really bad things, unless you're in a large financial institution, in which case sometimes you get special treatment. But generally, entrepreneurs who roll the dice and do a good job get really, 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 really rich. They do send a large check to the United States Treasury on a quarterly basis, an annual basis, but they get a lot left over. They're allowed to keep it. There's no ceiling on that. Mm-hmm. And that in turn creates something that the United States has that very few other countries have, which is a very strong venture capital market. That is a market where individuals are steering capital, economic resources with a high level of risk and a high level of return. Very risky and very innovative and very uncertain, and a lot of them go broke, and we say too bad, and if they succeed, you get really rich on that as well. You can add to your pile. What advantage, if any, and I think it does provide an advantage, but what do you think advantage that provides the United States relative to these other countries where the private sector is relatively small, and that kind of innovation, I don't think it happens in those other countries. How are they succeeding without that, if I'm right, or am I wrong?
A couple points. First of all, I think that I would disagree slightly with that. I think some of the smaller, more neoliberal Western European countries do have a lot of that, but since they're small, it's not as noticeable. I'm thinking here of Switzerland and the Nordic countries, which do actually, for their size, have a surprising number of billionaires and extremely wealthy people, and have some very small, successful, high-tech firms and so on, and actually some large multinational companies as well. But if you look at Silicon Valley, there's nothing really comparable, I guess, in the larger European countries. And I think that if you ask why are they successful, one answer is that they're not as successful as the United States. I mean, their per capita incomes are below our levels by usually about 20-25% if you adjust for cost of living. And I think, part of that difference is due to some of these factors you're talking about. We're a more entrepreneurial country. But, there's lots of parts of the economy and many things that are less entrepreneurial, they do as well or better than us. Probably the German car companies are better than ours. So their overall level is still around 75 or 80% of the United States. But the reason they fall short has to do partly with the entrepreneurial high-tech sectors, and perhaps partly because we're less regulated in, companies like Walmart can get up and going across the United States, I think, more easily than in smaller, more regulated economies. So, there's a variety of reasons that explain the income differences. And of course, we work longer hours here.
Yes, which is very important.
Partly because the tax and subsidy rates are different. We shouldn't just talk about tax rates, by the way. It isn't just taxes, it's taxes combined with subsidies. Because the money that's taxed doesn't disappear. It goes back to partly people that are not working.
Yeah.
So it's that combination really of taxes and subsidies that probably explains quite a bit of the fact that hours worked in European countries are lower typically than in the United States.
And Ed Prescott's done a lot of interesting work on that.
Right. And it's not the only factor, but I think it's certainly an important one.
It's interesting. It's interesting you mentioned Walmart. In the 1980s, when people were telling us we ought to emulate Japan, one of the things that I found strange about that was that the Japanese retail sector is extremely protected. There's very little competition. The government is very protective of some special interests there. And the United States has this reputation of being a much more freewheeling and competitive world, which I think it is. But it's interesting how now that Walmart's become so successful, what an adventure it is for Walmart to open a store. I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, and in Montgomery County, if you want to open a store of a certain size, and there's a cutoff in square feet, if it's larger than a certain amount, you need a special permit. It's not enough to get the regular permit from the city council, the county council. You got to get a special permit. It only applies really to two stores, Super Wegmans and Super Walmart, these very large footprint stores. And as a result, we don't have any, I don't think, in Montgomery County. Because if you're a business, you're trying to decide whether to make this investment. There's a lot of uncertainty whether you're going to get the approval. It's amazing how many things like that there are in America that aren't what we think of as free enterprise.
Well, right. And it's, Walmart is successful probably in the more conservative parts of the country. I think there's two areas that don't like Walmart. I guess cities like Chicago have not allowed them because the union workers and maybe some of the less efficient stores are worried about losing jobs.
Grocery chains.
And then, so what you might call the snobby elite liberal areas of the country look down on Walmart a little bit, or maybe have some political objections to the company. And so, there's that. I mean, even fast food restaurants are hard to open in cities like Cambridge, Massachusetts, near where I live. And so there's definitely regional differences, but in most of the United States, Walmart is welcomed.
Yep, no, that's true. Let's turn to this question that you raised on your blog. Try to pull together some of the issues we've been talking about, and let me set it up this way. What I find fascinating about the blogosphere and the political debates that we're going to be having over the next 5, 10, 20 years about the role of government is how hard it is to have a rigorous discussion and how easy it is to ex post construct a narrative that conforms to your worldview. So, for example, if you believe that the world has gotten much more free market since 1980, which you are somewhat sympathetic to, then you see the success of the 1980s and 90s and 2000s until recently as evidence that neoliberalism, for example, is good for economic growth. But there are people who take the other. There's four quadrants, right? You can say that government's gotten larger since 1980, and that explains why the growth rate's so mediocre. Right? So it's very difficult to have a thoughtful and provocative conversation on this. You wrote that starting around 1980, in the name of neoliberal reform, I'm going to read your post. You said, suppose you had gotten a room full of economists together in 1980 and made the following predictions. Over the next 20 years, the U.S. would grow as fast as Japan and faster than Europe, measured in GDP per capita, correcting for differences in purchasing power. 2, over the next 28 years, Britain would overtake Germany and France in GDP per capita, and you would be making those predictions because you thought Thatcher and Reagan's policies would be a success. Your predictions and the rationale would have been met with laughter. So you'd have been seen as some sort of right-wing kook if in 1980 you said this revolution that Reagan and Thatcher are leading in their respective countries is going to lead to really great economic success. And yet there was great economic success, correct?
Yeah, and I mean, one of the things that, modern liberals, even modern sort of sensible liberals, now here I'm talking about liberalism in the sense of left of center.
Yes.
They tend to forget how much things have changed since the 1970s. So some of the younger ones will say, well, of course we don't believe, government should run auto companies and steel mills and so on. And of course, we don't believe in across-the-board price controls. But many liberals did believe in those things in the 1970s. We did have across-the-board price controls at various times in the 70s, widely supported by liberal economists.
Industrial
Samuelson's
policy.
textbook predicted Russia would overtake the U.S. In per capita GDP. I mean, the idea that free markets would produce more rapid economic growth was considered pretty eccentric. Milton Friedman was viewed as somewhat of a crackpot back then by many liberal economists. I was in school then. Yeah. I remember at Wisconsin, where I was studying, he was definitely viewed as being very eccentric and almost like a crackpot.
Yeah.
And so, a lot of ideas that have gradually been accepted and are part of sort of the neoliberal consensus really have only become accepted in the last few decades, and people have forgotten that. And so I think that, there really has been a very successful transformation in people's attitudes in a number of areas. Now, if you're a pure libertarian, you can still look at the United States today and even the whole world today and be very depressed because you see government, involved in lots and lots of areas. But, I like to take the long view, and it's certainly, from my perception, the world is much more free market oriented than it was back in the 70s. And it isn't just my subjective view. Any of the rankings that I've seen, for what they're worth, also show almost every single country moving that direction. Don't quote me on this, but I think one list I looked at, I could only find 4 countries that got more statist after 1980 out of 100 to 200 countries. So I mean, it has been a worldwide trend, but at the time, a large number of British economists signed a letter basically saying Thatcher's policies were going to fail, and the British economy was in horrible shape back in 1979. It was almost a basket case, and so things have really turned around in that country, and now I think people just sort of absorb that, and they look at areas where neoliberal reforms haven't worked as well, or have been tried only half-heartedly and haven't produced miracles. And you see a lot of articles suggesting neoliberalism has been a failure. Can I read one quote from Krugman?
Sure. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Latin Americans are the most disillusioned. This is Krugman from a few years back. Through much of the 1990s, they bought into the Washington consensus, which we should note came from Clinton administration officials as well as from Wall Street economists and conservative think tanks, which said that privatization, deregulation, and free trade would lead to economic takeoff. Instead, growth remained sluggish, inequality increased, and the region was struck by a series of economic crises. Now, what I find interesting about this quotation is that if you, again, look at the rankings, there's really one country in Latin America that stands out, has aggressively pursuing neoliberal reforms, and that's, of course, Chile. And again, if you look at any of these rankings, it ranks much, much higher than the others in the Heritage Foundation. Chile is the 10th most free market, and the only other Latin American country in the top 30 is St. Lucia. So
massive
you've
economy.
got one country that has done far more in terms of neoliberal reforms than the others in Latin America, and it's also had an economic level of economic success that really stands out from the rest of the continent. It was recently, I think, granted status of developed economy by, I believe it was OECD, I'm not sure. And back in 1980, its per capita income was barely half of Argentina's, and now it's about equal to Argentina. So, it's been a real big economic success, but other countries have tried neoliberal reforms more half-heartedly, and many of them haven't done particularly well in Latin America. But I think if you really take a close look around the world and compare likes with likes, countries that are fairly similar to each other in different respects, usually the more neoliberal policy regime does produce better results.
Well, what would the opponents of neoliberalism answer? What would be their...
Some will point to they'll come up with examples that I think they misinterpret. One common example is talked about is China, which ranks very low on the Heritage Foundation ranking. It's a very mixed economy, and China is obviously growing very rapidly. But I would point to a few facts there. First of all, China is still very poor, much poorer than Mexico. Much of the growth is coming from the fact that it's become much more free market than it was under Mao. In fact, under Mao, it was almost completely non-free market. It was sort of like what North Korea is today. And during the last 3 decades, it's moved to sort of a half and half communist, half capitalist system. And it's not surprising that they've grown a lot from an extremely low level. But they're still a fairly poor economy. Second of all, I would point to the fact that the parts of East Asia that are Chinese and are more capitalist, like Taiwan and Hong Kong and Singapore, are obviously much richer than mainland China. And even more relevant, I think, is that within China, the more free market provinces, like Zhejiang, are the richest, and the more statist ones, like those in the northeast or Manchuria, tend to be laggards. So I think just like pointing to one country and saying, aha, China's got a lot of state involvement and it's growing fast, is really a gross oversimplification, and you have to really make relevant comparisons over time between countries and even between regions within a country to see what the net effect is of neoliberal reforms.
Well, I thought what was most fascinating about the debate that ensued after what you had written was people pointing out that, well, yes, maybe the U.S. became more free market after 1980, but the 1980 growth rates and the 1990 growth rates were very inferior to the 1960s, say. And the 60s, of course, there's a whole separate issue, by the way, of income inequality, which I think we'll get to maybe in passing, but let's just look at growth rates, average growth rates. So people would say, well, the 60s, we had the Great Society, we had a very active government. Those were the golden years. Some people even include the 50s in the golden years, which is, to me, a really bad stretch. But they'll say we did much better then than we were in this more free market world we did better when government had a heavier hand. And you make the point, which I think is extremely, you just never hear it, that the whole world the whole world slowed down at the end of the 1970s. This was not, you can't just compare America before and after this watershed date. You have to compare it also to the rest of the world.
Yeah, and many countries slowed dramatically. If you look, for instance, at Western Europe, some of the countries that didn't reform very much, like Italy and Greece, their growth rates slowed from, I think, around 7% to like 2% in recent decades. Now, what's interesting about the United States and Britain is we've actually slowed much less than a lot of the more statist developed economies. The growth slowed a little bit in the United States, but not dramatically. And Europe and Britain is a better comparison because Britain is a country that was sort of catching up like a lot of European countries. And people will point to the fact that, okay, Europe grew fast after World War II. That was a catch-up, so it was normal for it to slow down. But what was interesting is that Britain had actually fallen behind places like France, Germany, and Italy. And then when it did a much more aggressive reform program, it again caught up and surpassed them in per capita GDP. So, when you make those comparisons, I think they're more meaningful. And it's also revealing the few countries that didn't slow after the 70s were places like China, and it's not hard to explain why. China went from a rigid communist system to a more, half market-oriented one. So I think if you look at these on a more case-by-case basis and make the relevant comparisons, the net effect is that growth slowed less in the countries that reform more vigorously on average. I wouldn't say neoliberal reforms worked in every single case. The results in New Zealand, I think, have been kind of disappointing. But in the majority of cases, the more aggressive reformers, I think, have done pretty well.
I just want to mention in passing something that we should at least talk to briefly, which is the informal sector. One of the things that's going to show up in measured Chinese numbers is when you have massive migration from a rural area to the cities, your measured economic growth is going to go up a lot just because a lot of what was happening economically wasn't being counted. And similarly, I meant to mention this before, I think in a lot of these high-tax countries in Europe, the black market, underground tax-free sector is also, particularly in Italy and maybe in some, and I think in the Scandinavian countries as well, there's a lot of barter where people are doing stuff or off the books to avoid those high tax rates. And that's okay. And it's probably not, it's going to show up in the economic data very different ways depending on the form it takes.
Now, I think that Italy has started trying to estimate the underground economy. And I think they've put some estimates into their GDP numbers. I don't know whether they're in the official ones or not.
Yeah, just, I think one of the...
But yeah, that's a good point. And one of the things that's happened in Europe is they talk about all the extra leisure time, but someone pointed out that one thing that's going on is that people are substituting home production for production at work. Mm-hmm. So because of the high tax wedge, you can save a lot of money in many cases doing things yourself.
Yeah.
Painting your own house or, that sort of thing.
And it comes back to the point about what you measure is hard to know what you're actually measuring, right? And you call it hours of work versus leisure. Just because you're not in an office doesn't mean you're hanging around doing nothing.
Right. And so what may be happening is not so much that Europeans are working a lot less or as much less as they appear to be, but that they're substituting this home production. So the real problem with the tax rates may be more of an inefficiency thing, where instead of getting the advantages of specialization, you're going back to sort of a do-it-yourself culture, which obviously reduces efficiency because you're less specialized at the tasks you're doing.
Yeah.
So I mean that's one interesting take on that question.
Let me give you my pet theory about the transition in the 80s that I don't hear about and get your reaction to it. As you point out, there was a slowdown either in the rate of growth or in some places actually went from positive to negative in the late 70s. And one of the things, so the question is, what was the cause of that? And there's lots of discussion. A lot of people blame high oil prices, which I find very uncompelling, although it's true that our economies were more dependent on energy maybe in those days than they are now. But we've had lots of increases in oil prices recently that didn't have much of an effect at all. So I think that's a hard...
No, I think oil is very overrated.
It's a hard sell. The thing I point to that no one seems to talk about is demographics. What happened in the 1970s all over the world was a dramatic increase in divorce. So the number of households increased much faster than population. There was a social challenge of people suddenly finding themselves in the workplace who hadn't been there before, typically women. There were a number of people who had planned on not going into the workplace who now had a set of skills that they had not planned on having to use. The measured data, just from the fact that the number of households changed, when you look at data measured in household terms rather than per capita terms, gets distorted. When you look at, say, the bottom quintile, because there are now people in that quintile suddenly who were there in the data before, but now are in their own household.
Exactly. And
so
you know what?
And by the way, I think this was mainly driven by, well, we don't need to go into what it was driven by, but there's no doubt that around the world there was an enormous demographic cultural challenge and response. And it's not surprising that changed the growth rates independent of economic policy.
Right. And, one of the most misleading economic statistics out there are the income distribution data. The quintiles don't measure what people visualize. When you see the data and you see the bottom quintile, you think, oh, those are the poor people. And the top quintile, you think, those are the rich people. And that's absolutely not correct. Those are, to a very great extent, measuring people at different stages in their life. I lived probably in the bottom quintile for about 8 years as a young adult, and yet I wasn't in any sort of socioeconomic sense poor. I was a young middle-class person.
Yes.
On the other hand, there are poor people who are in the second quintile, who maybe make $30,000 a year and are taking care of a family in an expensive urban area, and that probably puts them, I would guess, into the second quintile. But in a socioeconomic sense, they're poor. And then there are people in the top quintile, like a Boston cop that makes over $100,000 a year, that aren't really what you think of as a wealthy American, or maybe a nurse that makes $100,000 a year. So what we think of in terms of class, what we visualize in our mind in terms of different classes, and what show up in those quintiles are really two very different things.
Well, the problem I have is when they make the comparison between a quintile in 1975 and a quintile in 2000,
right, and
as if they were the same people.
Exactly, and there's more of these, like, again, when I was young, so there's people with extended adolescence, if you will, making low incomes well up in their 20s, who are actually middle-class type people, come from middle-class family, well-educated.
And they have a high lifetime standard of living. It just isn't at a point in time observable.
And you just can't compare someone who's a, well-educated person who's in their 20s and working at, Borders bookstore for a year, making $20,000, to another family that's a, Hispanic immigrant with kids working as a roofer, making $20,000, trying to raise a family. The guy working at Borders is single, say. They're completely different classes in the way we think of class, and yet they may have the same monetary income.
Except that roofer's making a lot more than $20,000.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, and he could be into the second quintile even, and still be considered relatively low income. most of the top quintile, the 80 to 100%, almost all of it is what most Americans would regard as middle class. If you met these people, saw their income, saw their job, you'd think that's a middle class person. Probably only the top 1 to 5% would be considered really affluent.
Well, a lot of those folks in that top quintile are living in high cost of living areas like the major American cities like Boston, New York, LA, Chicago. They have very high housing costs, very high education costs if they send their kids to a private school, and their actual access to resources is very distorted by those prices, obviously.
Right. Yeah, the real estate prices get bid up to reflect the amenities, and so and this is some people have pointed this out that the cost of living for the wealthy arguably has risen faster than for the lower income groups, because the lower income groups have benefited from sort of the Walmart phenomena, and the wealthier people are competing for all these goods like, homes near the ocean and, other specialized products that have risen in price more rapidly.
John, my colleague John Nye wrote a very nice essay on that. We'll put up as a link. So we're almost out of time. Do you want to close with? Want to summarize what you think we know? I'm as most of our listeners know, a big skeptic on the ability to make precise statements about these causal connections between these large, very difficult to measure economic variables. What do you think we've learned that's going to stand the test of time about growth and economic policy? What have we learned?
Well, maybe if you'll allow me, I'll mention what I think is the most interesting finding in my research. Try to mention it briefly.
Go for it.
I found that between 1980 and 2005, the countries that reformed fastest, that moved most rapidly away from statism, were countries that had the sort of most civic-minded attitude, according to these two surveys I mentioned earlier, having to do with attitudes towards corruption and so on. Mm-hmm. So what I argued is that what happened in the middle of the 20th century was that the Great Depression sort of discredited capitalism, and idealistic people all over the world became more socialist in their view about what would be the best policy. And then, starting in the late 70s, attitudes switched again, not completely away from socialism, but away from the statist part of it, still holding on to the social insurance. And when attitudes started to shift towards free market economics after the late 70s, the countries that reformed most quickly were those that were the sort of the most idealistic in a sense. And that's because in the less idealistic or civic-minded countries, powerful special interest groups that earned economic rents from various sorts of government interventions didn't want to let go of those interventions. And so they reformed much more slowly. And I did, and I think that's, to me, the most interesting finding in my research. I mean, it's easy to find just correlations at a point in time between all sorts of variables, and there could be any number of reasons. But what I found is if you looked at how idealistic countries are, that also explained the rate of change in their reform process between 1980 and 2005. So the places that reformed fastest, like New Zealand and Denmark, were those with the most idealistic values. And that suggests to me that the narrative you hear in the press that neoliberalism is some sort of right-wing plot is completely wrong. We have to sort of look beyond ideology here and recognize there was actually a sea change in people's attitudes towards markets, and that in areas that were the most idealistic, and indeed you could almost say the most liberal in the broad sense of the term liberalism, were those areas that moved towards markets most rapidly. So that's why I don't agree with the popular left-wing theme that this is all sort of a right-wing conspiracy by capital to, expropriate more money from the workers. I just don't think the data supports that at all.
My guest today has been Scott Sumner. Scott, thanks for being part of Econ Talk.
Yeah, thanks for inviting me.
This is Econ Talk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more Econ Talk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for Econ Talk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.